What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Pick Swap podcast. It's James Brain and Sean Bernard as usual. Sean, how you doing, brother?
Pretty good. And here with special guest Harrison Grimm from the Liberty Ballers. Check him out on Twitter, Harrison_Grimm, and super excited to have him on and talk some Sixers.
Absolutely.
So,
Oh, sorry about that.
no, you go ahead.
I really appreciate you guys having me on. I'm really excited to talk Sixers as always, even though we are kind of in a not so good spell, if you will. But I really appreciate the invite on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
man, we appreciate you coming on. We're excited to get started here. So, like you said, it's been a little difficult over the last couple days. This past week was pretty rough for the Sixers in terms of just losing games they shouldn't lose. Back to back against the Heat and Nets. Both those teams were really shorthanded. A lot of guys out with COVID, a lot of guys out with injuries, and here we are, back to back losses against those teams. So Harrison, I'll throw it to you first. Just what were the biggest takeaways from those two games, especially considering, kind of how bad the Sixers looked against teams that weren't at full strength?
Yeah, I mean, there's no real sugarcoating it. Those are two really bad losses. You can even group in the Grizzlies loss
Yeah.
from the other game ago because, that's three consecutive games now in which we've seen them lose to shorthanded teams. The Grizzlies, obviously, without John Morant. I will say this, though, that you can kind of justify the Grizzlies game just because they're one of the deepest teams in the NBA. They're a really, really good team. And also, you can justify the Brooklyn game as Kevin Durant being Kevin Durant. We know what he can do. There's really no excuse for the Miami game. Them just losing that was just a really, really bad loss. And obviously, right now the team's going through some really tough times.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, first off, the COVID stuff has been a NBA issue. It feels like every single team is kind of a shell of themselves right now. Everybody's dealing with, and that's been super disappointing to watch play out. And hopefully things start to turn around there. And then on the Sixers end, like you said, I mean, the Grizzlies on the heels of the Warriors win as well. I see that one as a little bit of a pass. Those games are going to happen, 82 in a season. The Heat game, I would say, is especially disappointing to me. It was at home, a team that typically is a rival, games you get up for, games that should be you want to win, and they just kind of sleptwalked through the first half of that game for sure, and even in the third quarter a little bit. And I was actually at that game and had a chance to see that one in person. It was just kind of like a waiting for them to flip the switch, and that they've seemed to be getting into the habit of that this year, of just kind of like allowing themselves to drift back and waiting to kind of bank on competing at the end and catching back up, and just that is not a successful strategy for winning on a regular basis. So there are teams that you can do that against, but that's just not the mindset we can have. And it's been disappointing that it is becoming a theme with this team.
Yeah, and it's really only gotten worse, it seems like. And these two games were just like there's no energy. There's no energy, and like Maxey brought it against Miami and he had a late surge. And then, last night there was a mix of guys in the bench unit really came through to kind of bring the energy. But then again, like gets down into the late stretch of the game. The Sixers are tied at 101, tied back up at 103, and then obviously KD kicks back in and he does what he does. And it's hard to like get frustrated at that because he's been doing that for, a decade plus, and that's who Kevin Durant is. But like you shouldn't be in that spot. So it's really frustrating to watch this team kind of just let these wins slip out of their hands when like now you're back at 500. You're the 8th seed in the East right now. It's not looking good. When we're talking about, to go back to Maxey a little bit, we're all obviously very excited about him and who he is as a player. Harrison, what have you seen from him and Embiid with the struggles of them playing together? And then we did see a little bit of a breakthrough with Maxey being really aggressive against Miami. So was that something that you saw as a step in the right direction or an outlier in a stretch of like tough games with those two together?
So Maxey's usage and just the way that the Sixers have used him has been just very kind of strange. That's the best way that I would describe it throughout the season. They're basically kind of using him as a smaller Ben Simmons, and you guys know this, and I know this. They're not the same player. Ben Simmons, you're talking about 6'10" point guard, can rebound well, or point forward, I should say. Tyrese Maxey, obviously much more of a gifted scorer, not quite the same facilitator as Ben. So I don't know if it's the coaching staff's decision to just kind of have him float around in the dunker spot or whatever, but it hasn't really led to much success. We've seen just kind of how inconsistent he's been with Embiid back into the lineup. He's not really an offensive focal point. And Doc Rivers has kind of alluded to trying to grow him as a facilitator, trying to make him kind of like a Ben Simmons or even a Rondo type of guard. And that's not really what Tyrese Maxey is. He's not a natural born facilitator. He's a gifted scorer that can kind of play make second. So when it comes down to Maxey and Embiid, they simply just have to run more sets for Tyrese Maxey. We've seen a lot of success where Joel has set high screens and Tyrese Maxey has been able to get downhill and just blow by people. They should do that more. I don't really understand why they haven't done that. The majority of their sets have been two-man game between Seth Curry and Joel Embiid. And while that's successful, it can't be your only thing.
Mhm.
And then we've seen Tobias Harris sprinkled in there. So really, it just comes down to Doc Rivers and the coaching staff finding the best way to utilize Tyrese Maxey. And he's good enough. I truly believe he's good enough to be the second or even third option on the Sixers team.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a funny way to me, when I kind of sit back and think about it, it is weird how Ben Simmons and Tyrese Maxey's games kind of complement each other. And it's so crazy, like the
Hmm.
spot that we're at. But like you said, they're just not the same player. And I think I'm not as bought into Maxey developing as a facilitator as I think the Sixers are keen on him making. I'm more in the terms of this guy's really good at getting to the lane, finishing around the basket, scoring and creating for himself. Let him do that. Like, let him do what he's best at. And I absolutely want to see more of him and Embiid in the two-man game. Like, his pace and the way he turns the corner and gets downhill is an NBA skill. And just using that to open up things, just that fear of driving by can opening things up for Embiid. And that's just another like kind of a new something we have in the offense, like a new kind of characteristic that has never been there before. And it does feel like there's like a stubbornness to like sticking with Curry. And Curry's been excellent. So I don't want to like shut that down too much because that's absolutely should stay on the table. But there have to be different looks that you're providing. And the offense has just been so predictable all year that it's been like frustrating down the stretch that you just know what you're getting. And outside of the give the ball to Embiid and watch and the Seth Curry two-man game, that's pretty much what we're getting down the stretch. So there just has to be more creativity with those looks and just finding better ways to get your good guys scoring. I really believe that Maxey is kind of the second best offensive weapon on this team, and the offense needs to adjust to accommodate for that.
Yeah, and like you said, Harrison, I think it's the coaching staff in a lot of ways, and I think that they've come up short in multiple ways this season. And like I even think about last night, looking at that Nets game and thinking about late the final quarter, the final minute, the final 2 minutes, and as much as you love Tobias in general, and you know he should be on the floor, 3 of 17, 11 points, and this is something obviously we're going to talk about this because it's been the talk of the town so far. But like, don't it just seems like the Sixers sometimes miss that situational awareness, and I don't know if that's a Doc thing. I don't know if that's just the stubbornness of the coaching staff. But looking at that and seeing Matisse not in the game at that time, for anyone, and the only two guys that scored down the stretch are Seth and Joel, and obviously they're going to be the two go-to guys in this situation. But getting 5 players involved and making everyone a threat doesn't seem like that's part of the Sixers game plan in that late stretch. So how frustrated have you been with the coaching staff and what they, where they've come up short this season in general?
It's tough. Now, I can't blame, the coaching staff for the Sixers just not making shots, which they haven't, in the past few games. They aren't out there taking the threes that these guys are taking. But there's definitely things I feel like they can do better. I'm really surprised that Doc has been so stubborn with just kind of doing the whole starting group and then bench
Mhm.
group and not much mixing between them. When I feel like you can do it a lot more this season. Part of where I think they can use Tyrese Maxey better. Why not run him with the reserve group where he has a lot more offensive freedom, where he can just get buckets, which is what he's best at doing. I don't really necessarily understand tying all of his minutes next to Joel Embiid. I get you got to develop chemistry, but do you really have to tie like nearly 100% of his minutes with him? I don't really see the argument for that. So I think I would really like to see the Sixers kind of go with a Maxey Harris kind of lineup. Harris would give Maxey a scorer to run alongside with. And then you can run Niang with Joel Embiid for obvious reasons. He's a gifted shooter. So I think there are things that they can be doing better, and it is starting to get to the point where some frustration, not just with myself, but with the fan base, is starting to build up because we want these changes. We have yet to get those changes, and we are now, I believe, like 30 games in or so, somewhere around
Mhm.
that point. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty big sample size. And while 500 is fine considering the circumstances, they should certainly be better.
And as a whole, I mean, this year's been so weird in general, just with the looming trade stuff, and the actual outlook of this team is so kind of unclear. And just frankly, 2 months from now, we're probably looking at a vastly different roster than we have right now. But with the roster that we do have, like, there absolutely are things that need to be changed. And I totally agree with everything that you said. The biggest value that Tobias has brought in my mind has been running with that second unit, and especially last year I thought he did an excellent job when he kind of would carry that unit, and we just haven't seen enough of that this year. And Doc has been this way throughout his career, but especially since he's been to Philly, just tying minutes with guys. And it's like there has to be some fluidity with like game management and how the game's going and adjusting to that. And I guess that would be my biggest frustration with, like, let Maxey, when he's playing well, like, leave him out there. You don't have to like stick to such a script. And I think there has been too much like structure in that regard, and I would like to see some flexibility throughout the game for how things are going, and just let these guys like play naturally. There's too much of just like sticking to the unit, sticking to that. Like, let it happen. That's one of the beauties of basketball, is the flexibility, the things going, everything a little different look. So I absolutely agree there should be more of that, but it is really hard kind of managing this team with just like such unclear things looming.
So, and I guess that kind of segues us into what we should talk about. And like, let's, I guess before we get to even Ben, because we're at past that December 15th threshold,
hmm
and things are starting to heat up. Apparently, as of last week, things are happening. So, but I want to talk about Tobias to you first, and just your outlook on him. What is the best thing to do with Tobias right now? Because he's not producing near the level that we need him to be a competitive team, with or without a second star in that lineup. Like, if Tobias is still here as your third player, are you content with that, or is that something you're still looking to improve on?
Yeah, so that's the million-dollar question after Ben Simmons stuff is where does Tobias Harris kind of fit into all of this? And Tobias is a fine player. He's a good player. He's just unfortunately on a bloated contract. So when it comes to him, I think the Sixers, it's tough because, like I said, he's a good player. Obviously, not quite the talent level of where his salary is. So if you're trading, a player or two for him, you're not necessarily going to get that same talent back, and that's part of the reason why I think the Sixers haven't traded him. I don't think they could get a return that is equal or better than Tobias Harris right now. So for the time being, I think the best route is to just kind of hang on to him. And I know people are going to moan and groan over that. But every year that comes off of that contract, the more and more movable he gets. Now, if it was up to me, I would definitely be looking at trades. I'm sure Daryl is. Daryl is always making calls, that kind of thing. One trade that I had a follower tweet at me that I really liked, and some Mavs fans even liked, was Tim Hardaway Jr. and Maxi Kleber for Tobias Harris. And any way that you can kind of split up that salary, in the form of the salary cap table, is really good. Tim Hardaway Jr. is that a bloated contract a little bit, but it's a lot movable than Tobias Harris. So I think the Sixers should look at exploring routes for that, and I'm sure they are. I just have my doubts on if that's going to be this season.
Yeah, you can sign me up for that trade if that's on the table. But to be fair to Tobias, I do think he's bit off more than he can chew, just in terms of like how much has been thrown on his plate. With like when he first came here, he was the fourth option between the big four of with Simmons, Butler, Embiid, and him. And then once Butler left, the Sixers had to re-sign him. So they had to give him the big deal to make sure that he stayed. And then since Simmons has stepped out, it's been him and Embiid as the two stars, which just has never been Tobias throughout his really career. And just those are huge shoes to be thrown in. So there is kind of a lot on his plate that I just don't necessarily think he signed up for. And just frankly, Tobias Harris is Tobias Harris. So you can't be mad at him for just not being able to be more than what he actually is. And he's a very skilled basketball player. Like, as much as he does get a lot of hate, and he frankly hasn't been very good lately, like, he still is a lot better than a lot of guys in the league, like you said. And I mean, my biggest point of view, and where I guess my biggest motivation to move him is I frankly just don't see him as a guy that full out complements Joel Embiid, which I think should be the entire focus right now. And when we think about the way that both guys operate at the best from the post and in the mid range, and he's not really the true kind of stretch four that we were looking for when we kind of had this kind of idea in our mind of Tobias Harris. But like, it is tough. The contract makes it difficult. I definitely think it's something that should be explored. I don't think it's very likely that he does get traded.
And I mean, like, I have nothing against Tobias. I'm a fan of Tobias, but it's just been very frustrating to watch. And like, maybe you can speak on this a little bit more, just without the decisiveness that he showed last year, and like he's just aggressive at the wrong times and then passive at the wrong times. Like he's having a hard time finding that balance of when to shoot. And last night he started out the game really really nicely. He had a nice pull up three, catch and shoot three off. Embiid played really well at the beginning of the game. Like, do you think it's just him trying to find a way to be aggressive to try to put up the numbers, but also not stepping on toes? Is that the problem that you're seeing, or is there more to what Tobias is struggling with?
It's tough because in ways he's definitely regressed from last season. Last season, he was a really productive player defensively. He was good. He was quick decision making, took threes at the right moments, and he did a really good job of getting downhill. And we haven't really seen that, whether that's COVID after effects, an injury we don't know about, or something else entirely. It's been a lot more like post ups and contested mid ranges, and when it comes to Tobias, if he's going through COVID after effects, which is something that we should take into consideration, it's hard to be hard on him for that. But flat out, he does need to do better. And my main issue with Tobias, and I love Tobias as a person. He's a great guy, as many people have pointed out. It's just kind of, I feel like it's a mentality issue because after that Grizzlies loss, he was like, we were missing a lot of firepower between Seth and Joel. And yes, that's true. But as a near max guy, you kind of have to have the mentality that you need to take over. You need to drop 25, 30 points that night for your team to have a chance. So when it comes down to it, I just feel like he has to be more aggressive in those moments. And with Joel Embiid, they gotta make sacrifices for each other. He needs to be a more willing 3-point shooter. I get he wants to post up. And then again, like as I alluded to earlier, that can be solved a little bit by running Tobias Harris without Joel Embiid, as they really haven't done much of. Now you have Andre Drummond in the lane, but that's something you could figure out. It's a lot easier to figure out. So when it comes to Tobias, I feel like it's a mentality thing, and I hope that both mentally and physically he is healthy.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think it has been decisiveness has been a big thing of mine of what he hasn't done. And we saw at the beginning of last season is something Doc preached from the right off the rip. And we did see it last year with him making quicker decisions. And this has kind of been like a Sixers wide issue this year, especially that's why zone defenses have been so effective on him is they're just not swinging the ball quick enough and not creating the openings. And shooting obviously plays a major role in why they haven't been beating the zone Ds also, but just having the what you're knowing what to do with the ball and having that so quickly is something that just makes such a difference. And it's very frustrating that this does seem to be multiple guys, not just Tobias, that it's been an issue for.
Yeah, and I don't know, and we've all talked about the situation a lot and how things have kind of played out, and maybe this is kind of them just getting their footing underneath them. And again, it's still early. There's a whole dynamic shift in this team, which is I guess is difficult to deal with. But as a consummate pro that Tobias Harris is, I kind of figured that he would be the one to shoulder that weight, him and Joel together, and move past it. But to really think about this team as a whole, it's hard not to look at we all know who we're going to talk about. And it's now past the point where I think people are starting to get antsy, and the Sixers are losing games they shouldn't. The things that they're missing are things that Simmons would normally provide to some degree. What is your outlook right now in terms of a Ben trade? What does it look like? Is it on the horizon? And any players in mind that you have?
Yeah, so I get the past 3 games have been hard to watch. It's hard to watch for me too, believe it or not. It's hard to watch from everyone. And obviously there's some issues with the team roster personnel. I think there's a lot of holes in this roster. It's not fully optimized for what it is right now. And I get why people are being antsy. The Sixers just lost 3 games in which they should have at least won 1, probably 2. But when it comes to the Ben trade, and this is why I'm glad that Daryl is in charge, is you can't panic and just kind of make a trade to make a trade. Like they could go out tomorrow or today and be like, all right, let's do CJ McCollum, Anthony Simons, and whatever. And sure, that would help the team to an extent. But from a long term point of view, like, do we really believe that Tobias Harris and CJ McCollum are the supporting cast next to Joel Embiid? Like, I don't think so personally. Um, So you can't just slam the panic button and make a trade. And I know that's not what people want to hear. And trust me, I'm tired of talking about it. I'm tired of seeing the news that isn't really news surrounding the situation. But you can't panic and do a trade that gets you even more stuck than where you are right now. So I don't think the Sixers should rush a deal. I get that's December 15th. A lot of the league can be traded right now. But the Sixers have to make the best deal for them. And I think Daryl will at some point this season. But in terms of players that I would like to see in a return, it's tough. The Sixers want a top 25 guy, but my definition of a top 25 guy might be different than yours. Like we all have different lists of who could be in that category, right? So some possible targets, I think that are a possibility. Maybe not now, but in the near future might be Washington's Bradley Beal. The Wizards have been pretty bad as of late. I tweeted out a screenshot of what Bradley Beal looked like as they were getting blown out by the Suns. He doesn't look happy. So that's a situation that the Sixers are obviously interested in, and that's well documented. That's everyone knows that. So that's a situation to watch. And I also think that guys like Jaylen Brown from Boston or Shea Gilgeous-Alexander from OKC, I think those are possibilities. And I think right now the Sixers could go out and get those guys. But that being said, I think the asking price would be huge. I'm not just talking about Ben Simmons and picks. I'm talking about something like Ben Simmons, Tyrese Maxey, a young player, and a lot of draft picks to get those guys to the point where it's probably not worth it. Um, so I think the Sixers are right for the time being. I don't think that guy is available yet, but there are definitely many situations to monitor around the league, even more than the ones that I just talked about, that could very well become a possibility later on down the line.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the bottom line is you only get to make this trade one time. So if you get it wrong, it sets you back way farther than that. So those are all great names that you threw out and all names worth monitoring. I guess my biggest concern is just like we seem so tied to this top 25 list, which frankly we should be because like that is the difference making what we're looking for. And just that type of player paired with Embiid sets you up for such like a great team. But my biggest concern is just what if those guys don't become available? Because and I guess the phrasing should be changed kind of throughout all this conversation is like the Sixers aren't missing on trades right now. There just aren't guys available. Like Daryl Morey hasn't missed on all these great opportunities. There really haven't been these opportunities that presented themselves yet. And they're absolutely right to keep playing the waiting game in hopes that happen and just waiting that happen. And I feel like there's enough rumblings and enough whispers and enough situations worth monitoring that something has to break in the Sixers' favor and that they have to be able to capitalize on that. But I am starting to grow concerned that they're just maybe there isn't. And then I guess what we do, and we've heard all the this could go on 4 years and all the talks, but I just can't imagine this dragging on longer than that. And I guess that's kind of the depressing thought kind of creeping to mind is what if we get to the deadline and just the deal simply isn't there?
I'm also worried about that because I mean, what do you do then? Like you almost just kind of concede the season because you have $30 million and an all-star level player sitting, MIA, not involved at all. So I guess Harrison, a question for you, I guess, is like, is considering the situation, if the deal doesn't present itself, we're into February, the Sixers are like, yeah, nothing's gonna happen this year. What are the odds just with Ben? Like, do you really see him sitting, never playing in a Sixers uniform again?
I don't think, whether or not he's traded this season, he's coming back. I think that's long gone. I think if that was a thing, it would have happened by now. The Sixers had both of their longest road trips already happen. It probably would have happened then. Um, but I do think, and I want to alleviate some stress around the situation. Daryl has to say those comments where he's like, "We can go all 4 years if we need to." He needs to say those things, or else,
Yeah.
he's going to lose out on a deal. It just is the reality of the situation. Does he believe that? I highly doubt it, but obviously I don't know. But I think you're right. I think the Sixers will have to make a move at some point this season, just because Joel Embiid is 27, 28. That's a year of his prime, and you can't let that go to waste. You have to give him some shot, at winning a title. And seeding this year is just kind of a mess. There's not really a clear front runner in the East, so anything can happen. If it does go beyond the trade deadline, like you said, let's consider the doomsday scenario where they don't find a trade, right? and Ben Simmons is on this roster past February 10th. I think there will be some plan in place behind that. I don't see the Sixers going into the summer just kind of banking on someone maybe being available. That's a big risk to take. So if they do that, I think there will be a motive behind it. Obviously, if someone knows anything about James Harden, it's going to be Daryl Morey, right? And any other intel around the league. So ultimately, I think he will not be a Sixer past February 10th. But if he is, it wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing in the world. Um, I don't know if I would say it's good, but it's also not bad. I'm kind of in a weird spot with that.
Yeah, and I am thrilled that Daryl Morey is the guy pulling the strings here, and that he is the guy in charge, and that paired with that Joel Embiid remains on this roster, the two things that kind of keep giving me hope. Because as frustrating it has been to watch the Sixers lately, and as disappointing as many of these games have been, it is that one nice trade, and we are right back in for real contenders in the NBA. So there is so much banking on, I guess, the way this roster shakes out and how things go. But I do have faith that just if we surround Embiid with the right guys, like, we're right back in as contenders. So that does keep me sleeping well at night.
Yeah, and like kind of like I said earlier, it's just such a tough situation. It's like kind of unprecedented in a way. Like we've seen a lot of guys push their way out of different situations, but we really never seen a guy fresh off an extension, a max extension, request out and then just not play. So it's it's untraveled territory right now. Luckily we do have Daryl Morey pulling the strings, like you guys said. But I guess the final question is now, like, in terms of kind of what we've been talking about, I kind of refer to it as like a flash rebuild is kind of what I see for this team to do in a short amount of time, whether it be the trade deadline or next summer. Is there any free agents that you're seeing? And I know James Harden hasn't signed his extension, and Bradley Beal is talking about, I know he's not a free agent, but you know what I mean? Like there's some things to be had here. Could you see them kind of almost saying, okay, this year's a wash. Let's go make a small trade, alleviate some financial stress in terms of Tobias's contract or whatever it may be, and then try to make a big trade for Harden or Beal or something like that in the summer?
I think that's something they're definitely weighing. I don't think that they would go necessarily the route of like a full scale rebuild or like or like what we saw with the Warriors from a season or two ago, where they, had a bunch of injuries and just kind of bottomed out, lucked into the number 2 pick. I don't think it's going to be something like that. But I do think a retool is worth exploring, kind of like what the Clippers did a few years ago, where you get some good players, you get a lot of picks, and you just kind of go from there. And eventually, when the opportunity presents itself, you can flip all those good players and picks into someone really good, like a Paul George type of guy. But ultimately, like I said, if Joel, unless knock wood that there's no injury of any kind to Joel Embiid, I just can't really see them selling Joel Embiid on the idea like, hey, we're just gonna punt a season of your prime away. We'll get like a lottery pick maybe, and some other guys, and we'll go from there. I don't think he would necessarily sign off to that idea. But I think, like many other avenues, that is worth exploring at this point. But ultimately, I think what will happen is Ben will get traded in the next month or two. And the Sixers will just kind of go from there and filling out the roster.
Yeah, I think we owe it to Embiid to at least kind of go for it too. Like, this is a guy who has given his heart and soul and been here through the dredges of Philly basketball, and to see him like arise to the level of NBA star that he's become, like, just having that type of player on your team makes such an impact. And frankly, if Embiid was not on this roster, I think the conversation is so different. We're talking probably a full rebuild this year. They're a terrible basketball team without Joel Embiid, which has been seen on multiple occasions this year. But just the fact that he is here, I mean, the end goal has to be getting a top tier star to pair with him. So no matter what the vehicle or the timeline is for how that's done, not that it doesn't matter, because the sooner the better, obviously, but I definitely think it's worth sitting back and waiting for that in the offseason rather than pulling the trigger for, I guess, like a mid-tier kind of trade. But I also haven't been that much against kind of, I guess, a retooling kind of trade, where if it was kind of Simmons for a boatload of picks and maybe young players, salary, whatever makes it work, that type of trade, I feel like it does kind of wipe away the headache for a little bit. And frankly, like I said, like, for guys not being available, you're still waiting for this to happen. And there are a lot of teams that I believe can talk themselves into a package of picks and young players for a star rather than something built around Ben Simmons, because while he certainly has value, and his value, I mean, Ben Simmons is Ben Simmons. There's been so much talk about what he can and can't do, but he's a very niche player for what, like, when you're looking to build a team. So it's not like this guy is a fit on every roster. And I do think there is more flexibility if we do look into the picks. Obviously, best case scenario is there is the even Ben for star and whatever the fillers in to make that work. But I don't think it should be shot down, the idea of punting for picks and young players and looking down the line.
Yeah, and again, I think it's all going to boil down to just what Daryl Morey sees fit at the right time, and like we've all kind of agreed that he's not going to let a season go or let Embiid go without giving him a real shot at a championship. Like he came here to win. I don't think he would be involved with the basketball team if he didn't think he could win here with Joel. So I think the plan overall has been to get someone that's going to give yourself the best chance to win, and that's what they're going to do. So we can wrap it up here though. We're hitting around 30 minutes. So Harrison, we really appreciate you being on. If you want to plug you have your Twitter account, and then you have a second Twitter account, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. So my Twitter account is Harrison_Grimm. That's Grimm with two M's, just like the fairy tales. And then my film account, I have a film account. For those who don't know, everyone can kind of go there and use film or watch film at their own disposal. That is at 76ers Film Room, so you can go check that out. And also, all of my work is at Liberty Ballers.
Awesome, man. Well, we really appreciate you being on. A lot of good insight on Daryl and this team. So thank you again, and we'll talk to you guys soon.